Welcome to one of the first in hopefully a series of presentations on figures. I just wanted to show you my little world or my little corner of the hobby, which is figure painting. So where does the figures come from? Well, originally you've all heard of lead soldiers. You know, they were originally used by the army generals to plan out maps. They actually played war games. They would practice their plans. And then kids in the 1800s got these as Christmas sets, and they would play around with them. There were originally two schools in this. There would be, the French had round figures, a little bit like these here, and the Germans made flat figures. And they were just stamped. You got two sides and a little base, and you would play around and do your war games with those figures. To this day, there in Germany, flats are a very, very big thing, and that's originally where they come from. And then the French, the lead soldiers evolved. You've probably heard of Britons in England, where they were painted in glossy colors and very, very toy-like. And you probably got box sets for Christmas and whatnot. So somewhere in the 60s, early 70s, people would collect those. People that were into Napoleonics. Napoleonics drove the whole figure aspect, historical figures originally. And collectors wanted to get more accurate versions than what the toy soldiers would manufacture. So they sought out artists to paint their figures from the books, and they wanted to have a line regiment or a different version of that, because let's face it, Napoleonic uniforms are basically all the same pattern. It's just the facings changed in the colors of the uniform. So some people started doing that, and they got pretty good, and then things evolved, and people wanted to get versions that were never made as toy soldiers, or they looked a little bit too toy-like. They wanted to get more active poses, so people started casting, creating, sculpting, originally in lead sheet and lead, and they would create one-offs for collectors, and then they would be painted either by the same artist or another artist, and so on. And at one point, somebody got smart and said, maybe I can make a little bit of money out of this, and started casting them. So one of the big companies, one of these originators, is a French guy called Bruno Lebovitz. And this is a pretty old company, Metal Model, and they're all made of white metal, like so. You know, you get different horses, you get hats, and you've got the bags of accessories that come along with them. And so that's really originally where this came from. And that's been that way for the longest time. This is another piece that I got. I just brought some samples of different manufacturers. This is from a British guy, David Greaves. Beautiful, beautiful models that you would get. Pretty big. That's a pretty good hunk of lead. Of course, there's no more lead in any of these. It's all been replaced. Mind you, some of the original figures will actually have strips of lead inside to make the belts for the guns and the sabotage and whatnot. So yes, when you build historical figures, you do learn some of the terms that came from the other, like a sabotage. So that's basically why I came in. I was really into historical figures. I had a mentor, Michel Davignon, and we have one of his pieces here. I'll cover that a little bit later. And I was originally a member of IPMS Ottawa, And Michel was the only guy doing figures in the club. And he would bring his stuff, and I was wholly impressed. I was mainly building airplanes, and to me, looking at the Michel's figures, or any figures where we had the annual contest, Capcom, in Ottawa, I would go to the figure section. My mind would be blown. This was one level up. We were doing a hobby. This was art, really. Especially samurais with all the little flowers on the armor. It was just incredible. And at first, I told myself, well, maybe I want to paint a couple of pilots to put with my planes. And then, well, that plan went out the window because once you start painting these little guys, you kind of get sucked into that universe. And that's what happened to me. And for a little while, I just stopped building airplanes and concentrated on figures. So, I did buy quite a few, but we'll come back to this little section later. I brought one of my original figures. Of course, the sword broke this morning just as I brought it in. And so it's holding off not too bad. But I remember calling Michel d'Avignon and telling him, I bought a figure, Michel, what's a couple of pointers? And he told me, well, I was painting in oils, actually. And Michel told me, well, it's not that hard. There's only a couple of things that are hard. It's black and white. And I looked at my figure and said, oh, darn. So, but it turned out okay. And one thing that I have been told, and that I tell a lot of people that I teach or that I mentor, is to not strip your figures. I'm looking at you, Glenn. Don't strip your figures. Just keep them as they are because it gives you where you started from and where you're going. You can compare and you can, oh, you know what? It didn't look all that bad. Actually, once I thought it was pretty bad when I was comparing myself to the masters. And so this is what got me into that. And I got this, I think this is one of my second piece. Well, not a second piece, but sort of mid-period here. And this came in contention a few times for Best in Show. And not because, in a figure show actually, and not because the figure was mind-blowing, the painting was mind-blowing, but they liked the concept. The nameplate has a lot to do with it. It just says got more, and this guy just received a volley of arrows from the Brits and the longbowmen, and he's just shouting out, got any more? So he's just taunting, and it's the whole concept that brought it up. This is another piece that I sort of mid-period. Deceptively simple piece, but what looks simple is actually very hard to paint. Doing the blending and on such a uniform is a little hard. On that topic, the figures that I've shown you were all painted in oils, because when we started, the first book we bought was Shep Payne's How to Paint Figures, and Shep Payne painted in oils, and everybody painted in oils, and they're a very, very good medium. And it's very funny because when I started, acrylics were coming into the Spaniards, the Italians were all painting in acrylics. So oils was the old guard, and this was a new way, and you just had to paint in acrylics. So I started painting in acrylics and jumped on the bandwagon. And now these days, for the last 3-4 years, oils are suddenly making a comeback. The guys in their 20s and 30s have never heard of oils, and now they're discovering this new medium, and so they want to learn all over, and you're discovering that each has its qualities, and so you can go back and forth between the two and mix the two quite easily. Um, this is one of my figures that I did in acrylics, and I wanted to play a little bit with the lighting. The lighting comes from this side here, so that's another thing you can play with in figures to make them a little bit different. Um, so that's the historic part of it. Um, Another segment of the hobby that's really, really growing. We would go to shows and it would be all white hair in historical shows, and everybody would say, "Oh, the kids are not interested. They're all playing video games, blah blah blah." Well, the kids are actually interested, but they're not building what you're building. They start off with Games Workshop, Space Marines. They're into gaming, and for every 100 gamer, there's probably 3 or 4 guys that really like the hobby aspect of it, and they start painting their Space Marines or their Lehman Ross tanks and modifying them, scratch building. So it's the same thing that we got sucked into. It's just different, right? And the fantasy side of the hobby is growing by it's just incredible. To the fact that historical is starting to die down. There's very, very few pieces coming out compared to what's coming out in fantasy game, especially now with the fact that you can do 3D sculpting and print it at home. It's just gone bonkers. So at one point, I was trying to get a couple of friends that were into gaming. They were pretty good painters. We had a little club going, and I asked them, well, if you'll attend the club, I will attend the game night. And well, they attended one meeting and never came back, and I got sucked into gaming. So this leads me to another aspect of these little guys. Now, you've probably noticed that the pieces on the table are all different scales. For historical, the main scale has always been 54 mil, like these guys here and this guy here. And as the guys are getting a little bit older, the scales are going up. So recently, 70 mil has been very, very popular, 70, 75 mils. And there's also 90 millimeter figures. The big figure I showed you earlier from here, that's 110. That's a little bit extreme. That's not a very common scale. But in gaming, the main scale has been 28. Now, let's see if we can't get this little guy to register. He's going to look like, but gives you an idea how small. It's actually 28 millimeters tall. Now, this game here, the scale is a bit different. It's about 35 millimeters tall, and proportionally, Hulk is also in that same scale, but he's supposed to be an 8-foot tall fellow. So just to say that that's one big aspect of the hobby that's going, and I haven't really got a fantasy piece painted yet. I concentrated mainly on painting my gaming army, but it is coming. Another aspect of the hobby is collecting or exchanging. There are exclusively figure shows, some in Canada, most of them are in the US, where you can meet other painters. And this is what happened with this beautiful piece here. I had a figure painted. It was Sean Connery in a movie called The Man Who Would Be King. And a collector really liked that piece. And it was the end of the show. He had run out of money. So he asked me, do you want to trade for your figure? So, yeah, sure, why not? So this is the piece that I ended up with. It's a beautiful piece. It's by Dan Capuano. I'm very honored to have Dan as a grandmaster, and so I'm very honored to have this. Some of them have been trades. This is actually an interesting project. This is a friend of mine who made this figure for me. Instead of having a Christmas exchange where we just traded the box and he traded the box and it just went into the pile and that was that, somebody came up with a contest that we would put 3 figures in a bag, bring it to the meeting, and your friend had to select one of those 3 figures and have it built for Christmas, the next Christmas. So that's how I got this piece. So I have a piece from one of my friends in my collection. Some pieces you can buy. I won't disclose the price that I paid for this because my wife is in the audience. And but this is from a piece from Mathieu Fontaine, which I always love. It's beautifully painted. It's got this microscopic base that makes me nervous every time I grab it. And I was talking about Michel d'Avignon, my mentor. This is a piece that got me into the hobby. I was talking to Michel recently about this piece and what influence it had on me. And one day I showed up at his place and he had a box for me, and he gave me that piece, which I'm very honored to have in my cabinet. So that's another aspect of it. When you go to shows, you do meet friends like any other, and make friends. And so that's about it for collecting, really. So manufacturing, I was saying that most of the figures originally came in lead or white metal. The problem with something like this is that they are very, very heavy. Most of them are manufactured in Europe, so we would be paying, a high price just to cover for the shipping of them. So the logical transition was to go to resin figures. And this is a beautiful piece from it's Lawrence of Arabia, and it's a one-piece bust, basically. It's pretty much ready to go. So that's what you get. Now, Bill and I have been talking about doing a series on figures, and let us know in the comments if you want to see more. And we would be covering how to prepare figures and paint figures, or how to set up your stuff. In the figures that I brought from manufacturers, again, this is another metal model piece. It comes in a little packet like this. You've got everything wrapped in a bubble wrap. They can also come in little tin cans like this, pretty original. And not all historical subjects are military. You do get this nice looking guy that I thought was interesting, or something like this. Now, most of the time when you get a female figure, the proportions will be exaggerated. So, yeah, so basically, and oh yes, the evolution is 3D printing. So this is a full-on resin cast of a fantasy figure. That's about the only thing I had ready that I could bring in today. I also brought these pieces here just to show you. This is essentially the same bust. So it was resin, and this is just primed. What I did is I just shot black primer first and then white primer on top, and it gives me a basic idea where the lights and shadows go, because when you paint, you have to exaggerate those lights and shadows, and this is the final product, basically. So, and these are works in progress. You've probably noticed the little wooden blocks. That was my original sand. This is another way to do it. I just wrapped it in cellophane. This is a figure of Popeye that I'm working on from Dolman Miniatures. Notice the eyes are not done. That's about the only thing I haven't done. And yes, you can paint the eyes as the very last thing. And another thing too is you can get these little handles that come in really, really handy. It's got a little magnetic base on it that you stick on. And yeah, so that's pretty much my presentation on the world of figures. Let us know in the comments if you want to hear a little bit more. We can cover the basics, how to prepare a figure, assemble, and do your setup, cover brushes, paints. We can probably do a whole segment on just those two. And once we get the hang of the video a little bit more, we can have camera over my shoulder, and I could actually start doing demos on how to paint with either acrylics or else. So thank you. Any questions?
When you put a figure together, do you decide what shape and size the plinth is going to be?
Yes, yes, I do. If you look at the table here, you've probably noticed from my first figure, the plinth is really too big for the figure. It overpowers the figure. So that's a very good question, actually. And as I went, and see the plinths are getting a little bit better as I go, as where this is a 70 mil. These two are pretty much the same plinth, but the figure is bigger, so it fits a little bit better. And as you can see here, you know, it's a tiny little block, and then the figure just basically takes all the focus. Same thing with the piece from Dan Capuano, right? So yes, you do. It's a learning stage. Most of the guys that buy plinths that are way too big at first. And but you do learn, unless you want to really tell a story, as where this guy here, you know, I had to have arrows planted in the ground to tell the story, so that was planned up. But how you're gonna pose him on the plinth also is a factor. Elevations, you can play around with that. I'm finally getting a little bit better at groundwork, and so that's a totally different aspect of the hobby, and so you can see progression as I go. But yes, the plinth definitively sells, and very often we see beginners buy a wooden block and just paint it black. And when you're judging figures, you should not be looking at the base itself. But we are human, and having a very nice plinth, very nicely finished plinth. These are made from a guy in the U.S. Whenever I go to a U.S. show, I just raid his stock, and they're beautifully finished. So it does make a big difference. Anything else?
You have offered more intense classes that people could pay for to attend, and you would give them really in-depth instruction.
Yeah,
Are you planning to get back to that at some point?
We can do that. Yes. Yeah, if there's enough interest.
Sure.
Yes.
So people in the comments again, if they're interested in that more intensive,
Yeah.
let us know.
Yeah. More like a one-on-one. We can do demos here, but they're very generic, right? As if you want to sit down and have a one-on-one, yes, you know, you learn a lot more that way, because it's specifically about your painting style, your figure, what it is you want to do. So it might be a little bit better that way, but that's a possibility. Yeah.
If you had one sage piece of advice to give to people who are interested in beginning to either collect or start painting figures, what would be a good sound piece of advice that you would pass on to somebody?
God. Oh, that could be a whole other. um, there are so many things really um, that I could just buy a piece that you love first of all. Okay, don't buy a piece that so it's popular or everybody's doing this or worse, I'm going to paint it from somebody else, right? Uh, if you have no interest in the piece or very little interest in the piece, say, then your heart's not going to be in it. So for our first piece, try and get something that a subject that you're really really into, and it's going to help you push through it. Otherwise, or if it's part of a project and it's an accessory to that project, well then paint it like an accessory to the project. And one thing too, take this big chip off your shoulder. Don't try to make it perfect. If it's your first figure, it's going to be your first figure. It's going to have mistakes. So just do the best you can and be happy with it and move on to the next one. Because if there is one thing in this hobby, it's practice, practice, practice. There's no secret ingredient to it. You just have, yeah, you can buy a good brush and it's going to help, but your brush strokes, everything comes intuitively and it's built up over practice. Playing with the paints at first, some of the paints you'll try, they may not work for you. You try something else and all of a sudden it works beautifully. Sometimes you work on a figure and nothing goes right. It just fights you to the end. It's like building any other thing in this hobby, right? And then you get projects that, sometimes what they call them, mouth cleansers, whatever. In between this big project, you want to build this quick little thing. And this thing just falls together and you're having so much fun and you bring it to the contest and it picks up first place because it just happens this way. So just build them, practice, and yeah, it will come.
Do you use an optimizer in your paint?
I'm 58. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I do have glasses and I do have the optimizer. I come from a photo background, and one of the things that I first started doing in photo in my 20s was photo retouching. Everybody would bring me their stuff. My eyes were all that great, but over the years, it's not bad. But one thing I can recommend if you're going to the optometrist for your next prescription, bring in a piece. Don't just tell them, oh, I paint small things. They don't understand. Bring something like this and tell them, I need to paint the eyes on this guy. And my optometrist actually came up and she said, okay, well, this is your regular, this is for reading, and this is a procedure I did for your figure painting. And that really made a difference. So I've been using those glasses for the past 10 years. Now I've got the Optivisor. But yes, it does make a difference. Okay. Light, yes. My normal setup is I have a fluorescent tube light in the background. So I will be painting like this. So it provides background light. And at my desk, I made two extensions. I have a shelf, and I made two extensions. And these cheap clip-on lights from IKEA, the student type rubber neck, I have them there right about here, and they're shining down that way. So I have frontal light, which is very, very important. Okay, if you only have a light coming in from the back on your bench, you're not seeing what you want to paint. And I have two lights. You don't want to have shadows you want to eliminate all the shadows because you're actually painting the highlights and the shadows on the figure. You're creating your own lighting. So you want it flat. You don't want any shadows created by your light to compete with that, right? So that's basically, and bulbs now, it used to be a big problem is getting bulbs that were daylight balanced. Now with LEDs, you just go to top 5,000 or 6,500 daylight bulbs. Yeah, we'll cover. It'll make sure that whatever paint color you mixed when you bring it to a show, then that's what you get. If you're using the incandescent bulbs that are really orangey, you're going to be compensating for this. Your eye compensates for the bulb, but not that much. So it could twerk your whole color scheme towards something you don't want. Well, thank you.